First off, welcome everyone.
So when we first start thinking about cultural competency, we really want to start with the understanding of really what is cultural competency, what does it mean, and then what are the tools and resources available to us and opportunities available to us to become culturally competent organizations. And about half of you said this is really what you want to be able to do, either understand, make sure that you're doing everything that you can with some eye or understanding to how do we build culturally competent organizations, how do we make sure that we are being competent across our communities and whatever that may look like. And so we think about culture. It's defined many different ways, and a lot of times we end up thinking of culture in racial or from a racial or ethnic framework, ethnicity framework. But that's really not the only frame, particularly in a lot of communities that you guys work in. The culture is not obvious. It's not that people that look different from us. It's not necessarily people who talk different from us, but it's people who may be of a different socioeconomic class. It may be people who may be newer to the community. It might be blue collar instead of white collar. It might be agriculture versus an emerging new economy or technology or service industry. Because really, culture is a group or community that shares common experiences that shape the ways its members understand the world. And this is a fairly common definition. We pulled it from the Community Toolbox, which is out of the University of Kansas. But the idea is that sometimes culture is not readily apparent. And thinking through when you're looking at what are the needs in your community, what are the resources in your community, and who makes up your community, to begin identifying what are the different subsets or different subpopulations in your community. Are you a fairly stable community that a lot of people know each other and their families have been around for a day from time immemorial, or are you a community in transition? We have a lot of people moving in, whether it be to jobs or for education, or because you guys are where you live is a great place to live or raise a family. Is there a significant amount of influx or a diverse amount of racial diversity or ethnic diversity? Are you starting to see a difference in the socioeconomic class, as well as how is your community aging? Are you starting to see more young people? Are you starting to see more older people over the age of 55 in your community? Each one of these really do represent a unique culture and a unique set of shared experiences that as community collaborations and as coalitions, we have to pay attention to because the needs become different, the resources become different, and many times the language and understanding of how the world works is different as well, not only from their experience, but also from how they view the world. And so we start thinking through and identifying what does competence look like, right? From a cultural standpoint, and looking at from a definition of DHHS, they define it as a set of behaviors, a set of attitudes and policies. And so it's how we act as individuals. It's what we believe and how we believe things, and then it's how we operationalize it or how we document both the belief system and the behaviors that we expect from the belief system. That's really what we mean when we think about policies: is what's the expectation for behavior, and what are the hard edges for how we act on our attitudes or belief systems. And they really come together as a system or as an agency or a program that allows us to function effectively, right? And again, diversity is not always apparent, right? And it's the idea of diversity from culture interactions, similarities within, as well as both similarities within groups, among as well as between groups. And as we think through how that looks and why that looks that way from different communities, is a matter of not only opinion, but also perspective. I tend to like when we're thinking about, how a community looks, or I'm looking at cultural competency from a new lens. I try to have conversations with people who've been around in the community for a very long period of time, as well as talk to people who are new to the community and get some perspective of how they view the community, how they see its diversity, how they define its diversity, as well as, go with young and old alike. And also making sure that we're talking to people who don't necessarily look like us, if that's a possibility in our community. Because the idea is that if we want to begin the understanding of culture in our community, we have to have multiple conversations with people that we wouldn't normally talk to, or don't typically talk to. And so as we think this through from a cultural competency standpoint, why is it important? As you know, in your work and the coalitions the groups that are on this call, all of you have achieved outcomes that have been effective in your own rights, in your own communities. So you understand that success requires people working together, and it requires people. And not only does your work require people working together, but that type of change requires large numbers of people, and large is a matter of perspective, right? So if you're in Van Buren, Iowa, large may be 100 people, versus if you're in Delaware County, Ohio, 1,000 people might be large, right? So large is a matter of perspective in terms of the size of your community. Each of our cultural groups do have a different perspective and a different worldview, born out of how they were raised and born out of their life experience, and quite frankly, born out of their expectations of their community and what they expect to get out of their community. This understanding will actually help us evolve and help us overcome the potential disruptive actions that some people take, because we may not be communicating or framing concerns, problems, messages in a fashion that pays attention or honors people's understanding and opinion of what needs to be done and could be done. And we know that when we become inclusive and we seek to understand before trying to be understood, that the decisions that come out of that process tend to be more inclusive, and they tend to be better, and the change that we seek tends to become stronger and more sustainable. So there's lots of reasons why it's important, but how do we get there? How do we get to this level of process, right? One of my mentors way back 20 odd years ago, when I first got into this field, we were talking about cultural competency and this notion of cultural sensitivity, cultural awareness, cultural competency. And I asked a very good question. I says, what does it mean to be culturally competent when you're doing community development work? What does it mean in our world to be culturally competent? And his response was, we're never ever truly culturally competent beyond our own culture. And even then we sometimes fail within our own culture. The striving for competency is what we should be aiming at in the seeking of understanding. And he says, he reminded me or pointed out that it's not about having one of those people at the table, but making sure that those people who need to have a voice that need to have a voice at our table, that have to have a voice with our issue, are represented at our table. And whether they're actively involved, or we have proxies, or we're having conversations within community, so we can speak from the diversity of opinion, we can speak from the diversity of culture. And he says, 9 times out of 10, that's the best we can do. Does it make us a culturally competent organization? No, but at least we're making the attempt for that cultural understanding and to be as inclusive as we can, and not forcing people to show up at a meeting to have their voices heard. And so in many respects, the practice of cultural competency, the practice of cultural awareness or sensitivity is, are we giving voice to those who don't have a voice but need a voice? And so if we think about cultural competency in this process as a pyramid, as what's on the screen, it really is, we start with understanding what's our knowledge. Do we know our community? Do we know what the different cultures, the variations of cultures in our community? Do we know what culture means for our community? Do we know what cultural diversity means for our community? And then, are we aware what's going on? Are we aware of what binds those different groups together? Are we aware what pushes them apart, or what the differences are amongst the groups in our community? And are we aware of their shared interests, right? So knowledge begets awareness, and this idea that if we're aware, we may be slightly more, if we're aware, we're going to be more sensitive to the issues. We're going to be listening to things differently. We're going to be reading things differently. And if we're sensitive, we'll become more inquisitive, right? And we'll seek to we'll seek to understand before we are understood, right? And it's the idea that if we are sensitive, because we're knowledgeable, because we're aware, we become more sensitive. We seek opportunities for inclusion, and at a very, very bare minimum, we're eliminating the naturally occurring exclusionary practices where people don't feel comfortable having conversations and engaging with the type of work that we know makes our communities safer, stronger, and better in the long term. And going back to my mentor, we may not ever achieve cultural competency because it is a process. It is something we should be striving for on an ongoing basis. And one of the ways that we think about when do we look at cultural competency, it's ongoing and always. But if we're looking at it from when do we really hone in on it, we should be doing it as part of our ongoing community assessment. So if we're collecting our biannual student survey every couple of years, we should be looking at has our community changed during that 2-year time period. Or if we're involved in a CHIP community health improvement plan process or community health needs assessment process in your community, if that's a 3-year process or a 5-year process, at a very bare minimum, we should be asking that question at the same time we're collecting that broader data. How has our community changed? What does the culture look like? Are we engaging in the different cultures? Who are the new groups? Has power shifted from an older generation to a younger generation? That's a pretty big culture shift that we're having in our country right now, as the second largest generation in the country is starting to retire. They're becoming, they're more of them are over, they're all becoming over 60, a lot of them are becoming over 65. And we have the largest generation in our country becoming adults, having families, starting to raise children, becoming in positions of authority and power and influence. That's the millennial generation. And so you're starting to see this cultural shift from the baby boom mindset to the millennial mindset. And if we're not paying attention to that, both from a community standpoint and a coalition standpoint, then we probably aren't striving for cultural competency. I know that in the people that we work with, that our millennials think differently and view the world differently because of their shared experiences than what people who are more the baby boom generation do. And it's not better or worse, it's just different based upon shared experience. And the framing of our conversations and the level of understanding changes as we begin thinking through how that work happens. And so we think about knowledge, and it is the basic understanding of what our cultural characteristics are, the history, values, behaviors, and beliefs, right? And those of you who work with us, pretty consistently know that, people have lots of beliefs, and sometimes beliefs inform behavior, but people will behave in absence of how they believe many times. And so it's not only looking at what people believe about other people, but do they act on that belief? And if they're acting on erroneous beliefs, then we need to change that behavior, right? and vice versa. If we're having bad behavior, what's that bad behavior result in? What's it rooted in? Where's it coming from? So we start with that basic understanding, and then this idea of awareness is that knowledge starts to go into action. So if knowledge begets awareness. But awareness is more than just saying, yeah, I understand that you're different than me. I understand that you have a different life perspective than me. But are we open to understanding? Are we open to listening to them? Are we open to changing how we frame our conversation? Are we open to change in our own environment and the problems that we're working towards changing in our community. That's that beginning of that, kind of that next big leap on that cultural competency pyramid. And then sensitivity is the next level. So we're aware of it. In many cases, sensitivity, I tend to describe it as being hyper aware, where we'll take what we understand, what we know, and we begin looking at the value of the differences and begin looking at what does that mean, and how do we incorporate the whole community, and how do we represent that whole community. That's that beginning of the process of, we may not have everybody that we need at our table, but we should seek to have the voices at the table that we need to have, even if they aren't physically present, right? So it's the use of that knowledge, and it's the use of the sensitivity, and beginning to put the sensitivity into action, and being open to that, to how we all bring different things to the table. And then looking at the idea of what does a competent organization look like? And so we think about the competent organization, it brings the knowledge, the sensitivity, and the awareness all under kind of one masthead. And we begin to frame our messaging, we begin to frame our actions and our programming and our initiatives, where we're not inadvertently leaving somebody out in our community that we shouldn't, right? We speak to the youth culture, and a lot of times what we'll do is that we'll say, well, we need to hear from the kids, or we need to hear from the youth to determine whether or not what we're doing is working. Well, that's one perspective, and yes, we need to have the youth culture, but then in the same respect, we need to have the balance of the adult culture as well, or the law enforcement culture, or the educational culture, right? In order to demonstrate that we're being whole, and we're not inadvertently assigning greater value to one group because of their life experience or lack thereof over another group. And sometimes when we're seeking to be culturally competent, or we're in the stage of cultural sensitivity, we sometimes go off that road and say, well, the kids said it, so it must be true, or the kids want to do this, so we have to do it because it's what they said, right? And we sometimes fail to balance it out with what we know from other people's perspectives, and as well as other people's perspectives and past experience. It's a danger when we start thinking about, are we being representative? Are we being inclusive? Are we hearing everybody, and are we valuing what people say, right? And so it's that it's the balance, and it's also the creation of the synergy between the different cultures and the different opinions in our community. So a couple tools that we have available for you as we move forward, as you think through what cultural competency is and how we make it more meaningful and impactful for our group, is start with yourself first. What is our personal goal for becoming culturally aware, culturally competent? What is the organizational, right? So on our personal level, it's our shared experience, it's being respectful, it's engaging, it's understanding. From an organizational level, do we have a practice and do we have a policy of inclusion? Or at a very bare minimum, are eliminating those things that are perceivably exclusionary, that keep people from coming to the table. The example down from North Carolina, let's have our meetings in the middle of the county, kind of on that borderline, as opposed to one end of the county versus the other end of the county, right? So we're trying to eliminate exclusionary practice in an attempt to be more inclusionary. Do we seek to have one of those people come to a meeting, or do we seek to go out and figure out how do we get the voice of the people who need to have a voice at our table, even if it's through a proxy such as ourselves or another coalition member, or even our participation as a coalition in another group, so we can be active in their group and have an understanding and carry the thoughts, perspectives, ideas from that group back to our group. Program level, cultural fit if we're doing programming, whether it be an evidence-based program or something we came up with, did we actually double check to make sure that what we're teaching and what we're saying with the intended target population actually makes sense? That was one of the biggest things with life skills when it first came out, was that it wasn't normed on rural life skills. LST, Botvin's life skills training was not normed on rural populations. It was normed on inner city urban populations, and initially they weren't getting replicatable results in rural communities. They weren't seeing the same level of impact pre-post test and from a behavior and belief position. And somebody pointed out to them, go, wait a minute, you're using this in a rural community, and it was never ever normed in a rural community. So there sometimes when we look at even evidence-based practices or things on these, approved lists, we have to dig a little deeper and say, where was this really tested at, and where was the research done? What does it fit my community? Does it fit who I'm doing it with? If we're designing it ourselves, looking for that one-off. And then community level is, are we practicing engagement and are we practicing tolerance? And I think tolerance is an interesting, not perspective. Tolerance is a conundrum, for lack of a better word, because we want to tolerate differences, we want to respect differences, but we don't want to tolerate bad behavior, right? It's the idea that, your freedom of action stops at the end of my nose, right? So what do we mean by being tolerant, and what are we tolerant of? Some coalitions, as they think through the cultural competency piece, they'll have a series of value statements where this is what we value and how we demonstrate our value. So if we value openness, we value inclusivity, and what are the actions around that? we have opportunity for shared opinion, open opinion, regardless of if we agree with it or disagree with it, and we invite all comers, right? So what's the value statement, and what's the back end action or practice that reinforces it? And sometimes that allows you to have that really honest, hard conversation about what it means for your community and what it means for your organization to be at least not exclusionary in your work. So a couple of things to think about as we move forward. Building that culture competency, we talked about the vision a little bit. That's that value statement. What level are you playing at? Are we playing at the personal level? Are we playing at the organizational level? Are we playing at the societal community level? Where do you start? I think those of you who shared, well, we have a pretty good idea of what our culture looks like at socioeconomic and age. That's where you start. And I would choose one of those if you don't have the capacity to do both of those. What does it mean? How are we going to engage all levels of socioeconomic? All different levels of socioeconomics, right? Or if it's age, and we're looking on the table, all of our people over the age of 55, we're missing something. How do we not only get people at the table, but how do we hear from, and how do we engage in interventions, activities that are respectful of a younger population, right? So thinking more beyond, we want one of those people, right? But what's the voices that we need, and what does that voice look like? And then assessing the organization. Where do we start? What do we have? What don't we have? What do we get next? A couple ideas you get around individual. We talked about the driving around and we talked about going to meetings, experiencing your community from a different perspective, not from where you live. Going, and I'm a reader. I like the idea of looking at histories, looking at and participating in those types of activities, whether it be the local history at the library or somebody who wrote a 10-page paper on the background and the history of the community. But then also looking, asking people questions who've been there for a short period of time, their perspective, why they're there, what brought them there, and people who have been there for a long period of time, what's changed, why they stayed, what they like and what they don't like. Organizationally, what is the expectation for competence? right? What is it that we're doing, and how do we demonstrate that? So again, it goes back to that values piece. At a very bare minimum, eliminating the potentially exclusionary practices that we have in place, and then looking through at our meeting space. Is our meeting space welcoming? One of the projects we're involved with is a trauma-informed care project with Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And one of the things we did as part of that project was a physical audit in terms of, so the project has lots of components. One of the components is after-school programming, recreational programming, socialization. Kids who experience high amounts of trauma sometimes tend to be isolate themselves and may not be overly social. So one of the things that we went in and we did an audit of where they're having the after-school programming for the kids who experience significant amounts of trauma. And one of the things that we found is that in school buildings, they end up being in gymnasiums. They end up being in places that are really, really loud. And they couldn't figure out why the kids weren't interacting, why they weren't engaging. And the research around kids with trauma is they need quiet. They need, softer colors. They need softer lights. They need comfortable chairs. They need time. They need space that they feel safe in, and that's not noisy. And so one of the things that we instituted as part of that, respectful for that particular, the culture of trauma, is the physical environment had to be welcoming. It couldn't be noisy. There couldn't be people bouncing in and out. There couldn't be lots of, it could be highly active. And by a simple change in the environment, the kids began to engage more because we're paying attention to the unique differences of that particular population. So sometimes physical environment means a lot, right? And making sure that it's welcoming and that it's respectful for all the type of people that we're seeking to engage with. There is a checklist on the toolbox that takes some of the known and well-researched ideas and thoughts around cultural competency and goes through, our coalition members represent a target population. Are our published materials relevant to the target populations? Have we taken into account our language, cultural, or socioeconomic? Is a checklist, yes or no? And there's about 13 items on this. And what we can do, this is on the portal, and so you can find it on there. And it's a simple yes, no. And if it's a no, will you address it? If so, how will you address it? And if it's items that you want assistance with, or if any of the ideas that people have shared, feel free to reach out to each other, and also feel free to reach out to us. We may, as you know, we don't have the answers for everything, but we have access to a lot of people who have good ideas and answers. We'd love to connect you. So as you grow and as you begin to incorporate or continue to incorporate differences in your communities within your work and seek to be as competent as you can, we're here to help. And if there's additional conversations you want with this or additional ideas, please let us know. With that being said, thank you for all that you guys do. Thank you for listening to me and participating in this and asking us questions. With that being said, I'm not seeing anything on the chat that we need to answer. You guys have a great summer day, and we'll talk to you soon.